There's a dungeon, there's profit to be had solving the mysteries of it, and there's something strange in the neighborhood to add that special twist. And if you had not already guessed, we're a fresh face forming a new guild to handle all of the above. And you have the plot of about 70% of the dungeon crawling, map making adventures that came out of Japan since the early 80s. This one, however, is slightly special as it is tied to a cult classic from the Nintendo DS that only recently got a re-release, now with HD graphics, which frankly don't make a huge difference, but more importantly, it is now adapted to work on one screen instead of two, so not quite enough for me to call it a full-blown remaster, but definitely a competent port. As with most games of this type, the story is, well, minimal, so we'll get that out of the way first. In this case, we're exploring the Yggdrasil Labyrinth, and I butchered that, but it's in the town of Etria, under the watchful eye of the chieftain and his associated organization. We have to assemble our customizable party and complete an assortment of tasks to get the right to proceed further down, which, in the case of this game, is mapping out the majority of the first floor of the labyrinth. After completing this, we get access to more missions from the town itself, as well as more assorted quests from the local bar, where the proprietor has an odd tendency to call us kid despite looking the same age as about half the avatars we can pick for our party members. Though, admittedly, a few of the characters do have lolly syndrome, so that might be where it comes from. These bar quests mostly end up being fetch quests for either finding a hidden item, gathering drops from enemies, or killing a certain number of enemies, with only a couple stepping outside that scope very slightly, requiring you to get a specific class above a certain level to complete it. The missions from the town itself, on the flip side, generally either focus on mapping a floor, interacting with a target, or killing a boss. As you dive down further, you learn the mystery of the town, the secrets of the chieftain Vizzle, and even the secrets of the Ronin and Hexer characters you'll run across, and eventually get items from them to recruit members of their classes. Overall, the remainder of the story is fairly standard for this type of game, in that if you've played most similar games, you'd know who the bad guy is as soon as he shows up in the story, and that's about as spoilery as I'll get when it comes to the very end. But I do want to call out one cardinal sin the game does with its story about 70% of the way through, and that is the unavoidable genocide. This is because fairly late in the game, you are given an illusion of choice with how to deal with a group of inhabitants of the labyrinth. But if you want to reach the end of your story proper, you're going to end up committing genocide regardless of what you select and how you choose to approach it. It's irritating, and while I know what they were going for, it's just bad storytelling, and it does not accomplish the moral quandary goal that most games doing this are aiming for. Instead, it comes down to quitting the game and not playing any further, or being a monster to finish the story. There is no good path that involves continuing to play the game. Moving on to the actual gameplay though, I have to say that overall I enjoy it. There's a lot of good features for this type of game, but in almost every feature you'll have a bit of that early Atlus quirk, which basically means a good game with some aspects that are acquired tastes, or that just seem a little bit off-center. Personally, I enjoy this since I've been an Atlus fan since the early 90s and am used to it, but I understand it may not be everyone's cup of tea. Starting with the very first part of the mechanics you interact with even before forming a party, you have the game difficulty, which comes in 3 flavors: Picnic, Basic, and Expert. You can change these while in town, so you're not stuck on it if you choose one you don't like, and you can toggle it back and forth. For my playthrough, I mostly did progression on Picnic to get the story in a reasonable amount of time, and went through testing both the normal enemies and the special bosses called foes on each of the higher difficulties along the way. And while Basic to Expert is a reasonable gap, with an appreciable but not ungodly difference between them, the step down to Picnic was like night and day compared to the other difficulties. Simply put, Picnic had absolutely no challenge. Hell, you probably wouldn't even have to grind to beat the postgame with it. The Basic and Expert do require some patience, some leveling, and actually refining and even possibly gimmicking your setups with some situations. After recording the story mostly on Picnic and doing those tests that I mentioned, and then going through a good chunk of it again on Basic, I have to say, if you want the full experience of an Etrian Odyssey game, play it on Basic, which it sits a little harder than where I would place normal difficulty in most games of the genre. If you want the story, or you just want to get the unique item in the second game, then play on Picnic and buzz your way through completing the compendiums as well to get better items. And if you want to challenge yourself, play on Expert, though expect to die a few times if it's your first playthrough. All of this is because the difficulty drastically alters your damage, durability, and, well, everything. So while you can learn the mechanics from another difficulty, the way it scales will throw you off while playing it if you're constantly swapping difficulties, so do keep that in mind. If you really love the game, you could also just go through on each difficulty using the New Game Plus mode, which lets you keep your progress and experience the increased challenges. Now, separate from New Game Plus, I did mention that save transfers to the sequel come up, but this may not be entirely what you expect if you've played other games with save transfers to sequels, things like Suikoden, Baldur's Gate, etc. This save transfer is a lot more limited in scope, mainly only transferring your guild name, altering a little bit of dialogue that doesn't matter too much, and giving you a special item depending on how you complete your playthrough the first time through. Basically, to get the good one, you need to 100% your compendium. But even then, it's not a massive boost, and if you're just in for the games, it's not going to change it enough to matter. New Game Plus, on the other hand, actually lets you transfer everything over, but only within the same game. With game transfers out of the way though, you actually have a handful of classes to choose from whenever you actually start making your guild the very first time, and you can fill up your entire 30 slots with them if you want, though generally I just kept one, sometimes two of each class for different types of farming, so never even approached the limit, especially since your active party is limited to 5 characters, and there is no party town component like you'll find in some other games in the genre, like the NIS competitors, Stranger of Sword City and the like. The 7 starting class options you get are mostly what you would expect. First, a warrior class that I'm not even going to try to pronounce with my limited German is your basic fighter, albeit slightly more offensive geared with decent sword skills, varied damage types, and is the main axe user in the game, though I found I preferred sword since it came with better skill options for dealing with multiple enemies, while axes were very much control and single target oriented. You also have the flip side of him known as the Protector, which is basically your tank and often considered one of the more essential characters for higher difficulties due to his ability to redirect and mitigate damage with a wide array of skills. He does have some healing that's kind of a trap, and he does do a decent amount of damage when geared for just doing damage, but he's very much the human wall for the rest of the party. Sticking to somewhat traditional roles, you also have the Medic, which is probably the least fantasy-themed name of the group. He's pretty much a white mage, but he's also fairly obvious about what he does, healing, and a lot of it. In this version of the game, while they're fine in the back row and most often placed there, they can also be fairly decent fighters too with the right gear. Not really competing with the more combat-oriented classes, but by the end my medic was moved to the front line and doing okay damage with late-game staff weapons, while remaining durable enough not to worry thanks to the Protector next to him, just helping him tank in the late game. Now, one frontliner I did not play much with was the Dark Hunter, who's basically your weird whip user that causes status effects. It's not that I dislike the bit that I played with them, but they were much more single target oriented and didn't quite give me the punch that any of the other frontline options did. Not to mention that they felt somewhat squishy compared to their friends, and you sort of had to decide on which status effects you wanted to focus on, since some are limited to whip, while others are limited to swords, so they never really made it into my main party. The back row for me pretty much always comprised of my early damage dealer, the Survivalist, which also was great at harvesting resources since they have access to mine, grab, and chop abilities, which lets you get the resources from the world itself. The reason I always had one was they dealt decent physical damage very early in the turn order. They also have the ability to reduce enemy encounters drastically towards the end of the game, which made progression and testing against foes much easier, and they still had plenty of points left over to invest in those harvesting skills to get me the supplies to unlock items and do quests, probably the only character that never left my party outside of single character quests. They were usually paired with my favorite damage dealer, the Alchemist, which is basically the mage of the group, able to cast elemental damage spells and even drop poison if you want. Though with the number of levels you can get, it's usually best to focus on 1 or 2 elements and go for the tech point skills with them, at least with how I play. They don't really have anything special outside of that, but they are unable to be matched for dealing with high defense enemies and for clearing out lots of trash quickly thanks to the decent damage AoE skills. That said, they are limited by mana, which is called TP in this game, so you do need to keep the kind of eye on that or use your limited inventory space to carry recovery items. Sadly, one class I didn't really give a chance until later was the Troubadour, and I weirdly regret it. They can use bows, which means they can do okay damage from the back row, in spite of not really having any proper attack skills, but more importantly, they are amazing support units. Admittedly, it's not going to outpace enemies wearing you down, but it will keep you freshened up, keep your tech points topped off, and even boost your party's experience for when you need to catch up a new character to the rest of the party. They do fall off in the higher difficulties, but are super useful for clearing out areas without having to do town visits, and for building out other characters as you kind of get them going. Now later on in the game, a little bit late for my taste, you get 2 more classes as well. First, you get Ronin, which is a fighter class of sorts that is a bit clunky due to having to get into stances to really do damage with their skills, which means exposing yourself for a turn. Combine this with their damage not really compensating enough for this, and they kind of felt like a weaker fighter to me, and maybe I didn't give them enough of a chance, but it really didn't do much for me, especially with how late you get them. And the Hexer, which comes even later, kind of falls into a similar failing, in that they have interesting abilities, but they just don't really feel as good as the main classes you already have, that cover similar functions. There were very few situations where I preferred the Hexer over, say, the Dark Hunter, or just straight up damage dealers or healers. And with how late it comes in, it just didn't feel good. I think if the party system was more layered, letting you have in-town uses for non-main party characters, it would have felt a bit more enjoyable to give the unlockable classes more time. And to round out the characters, you can actually retire them as well and give a new one a bit of a boost in having extra skill points. But I never went too deep down that rabbit hole. It just never felt necessary since I was able to get skills where I wanted them without the extra skill points. And since characters don't carry over, it felt like a waste of time to fully min-max them unless I wanted to go really deep onto the New Game Plus. Now, after making your party, you've got the basic town interactions with the traditional city building that gives missions, pub that gives quests for the town, equipment shop, church/apothecary that sells potions and revives characters, and of course, the entrance to the dungeon itself. You populate the shops with more stuff by selling bits and bobs you find in the dungeon, so your progress is generally tied to how much you farm a given floor, and it will tell you how far you are from unlocking certain things once you've sold a chunk of what you need for it, so it's pretty easy to farm for and actually target things you want. That said, though, the equipment is somewhat flat, due to not having a ton of special functions on the gear outside of very specific pieces. I would have loved to see more modifiers possible, but it was usually just pick up the gear that pumped the stats I need and sometimes grab an accessory to cover a gap or issue in a certain area, since they were most of the special functions in the game. Simplicity is nice in some respects in that it keeps you from having item fatigue, but a little spice would have given it a little bit more wiggle room. Now, diving into the dungeon with your party, we start on that first quest of mapping the first floor of the dungeon, or at least the parts we can reach, which brings us to the map-making aspects of the title. On DS, this was handled with the stylus on the screen and was fairly fluid, but in the HD version, this has all moved to work on one screen because it has to, and it has to work without a stylus, so it's clunky, even with the auto-mapping option maxed out. This is because, even at the most automated form, it fills in the floor you walk on and the walls you touch. Nothing else. So you still have to manually place doors, chests, traps, harvesting nodes, etc., which can get, well, tedious. Especially since you have to manually do the floors and walls under a number of these too, unless you don't mind janky looking maps with floating objects on them. The easiest way for me was swapping between mouse and keyboard and controller, since the pure controller options for it felt, well, kludgy at best. And while going through, especially early on before you get the skills that reduce encounters, you're going to be doing this while running into way too aggressive random encounters. Sure, you can run, but you kind of need the experience. The game is balanced around it. So expect to be juggling mental modes a lot between mapping and combat. Now, once you get past this bit of it, the game falls into a familiar dungeon crawler rhythm. Dive in, complete an objective, go deeper, explore, map, return to town, get new missions and quests, repeat until you get a biome shift, get the checkpoint, repeat. Enemies evolve their formations, tactics, damage, etc., and they also have drops depending on how they die. Even some enemies have kind of factors that only allow them to spawn at certain times of day. So it does stay fairly dynamic in that regard, though you should get used to palette swaps because there are quite a few of them. The game continues like this with different bosses, challenges, etc., even one where you're supposed to use the fact that the map tracks big baddies for you, so you can avoid being detected by a specifically nasty monster and steal their eggs. Though that was sadly the most creative of the encounters in my opinion, it could have actually done a lot more. Needless to say, the actual gameplay is simple, straightforward RPG goodness that you can do while listening to a podcast if you just want to grind, or that you can pay more detailed attention to while progressing the story proper. Though always be wary of what quests you pick up, some of them are definitely harder than others and you can only carry so many. So before you pick up those solo challenges, make sure you have someone that can handle them. Sadly, the endgame or postgame, whatever you want to call it, doesn't differ much. The floors just continue to get more complicated with more damaged floors, traps, tricks, etc. that you need to decipher. Though thankfully there are plenty of maps to guide you around, and I even ended up using them after about the 20th floor to push things along since it gets a bit complicated to map and follow at that point. The enemies similarly get tougher as you'd expect, but it is more of the game and you do need it if you want to get the 100% compendiums for transferring to the next game. Though thankfully you don't have to do most of that if you just want to do New Game Plus, because it gives you the option as soon as you beat the actual boss of the dungeon rather than going to the very bottom. Overall, I find this game cathartic, albeit a little short if you don't get stuck on anything, at least compared to other games in the genre. But I think the shortness works for it here since while the mapping system overstayed its welcome, the game itself did not. It was an enjoyable few day long dip into a dungeon crawler that I felt satisfied with beating and didn't crave more or less of, and it ended up taking me about as long to beat as Legend of Grimrock for a crude comparison, though Etrian Odyssey admittedly has a bit simpler mechanics. Now here is where I'd send you off to another dungeon crawler, but I'm still working on those reviews, so until then, here's another turn-based game you might enjoy that's a bit more complex, yet still fun. And if you're checking this out a few weeks down the road, I'll try to remember to drop a dungeon crawler in here instead.